The letter arrived on a Monday. I almost didn't check the mail that morning, but something told me to take a look. The envelope was thick, official-looking, stamped with urgent, final notice in bold red ink. My name, my address, nothing unusual. But the moment I tore it open and scanned the first few lines, a slow burn of disbelief and anger settled in my chest. Notice of delinquency payment due. $14,700 failure to pay will result in property foreclosure and auction. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might change. Foreclosure on my house? I had bought this place outright. No mortgage, no debts, no obligations, and I sure as hell never signed up for the HOA. From day one, I had made it clear I wanted nothing to do with their endless rules, pointless regulations, and overpriced fees. I wasn't about to repaint my house just because some overbearing committee thought the color was too bold. And I definitely wasn't going to pay thousands of dollars for services I never asked for. But now, according to this letter, if I didn't pay up, they would seize my home. I wasn't even part of the damn HOA. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind this. Karen Whitmore, HOA president, self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. A woman who took pleasure in lording over the residents like a tyrant ruling her kingdom. Every conversation I'd had with her was the same. Thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly reminders, warnings about how it's best to comply if I wanted to live here peacefully. I had ignored her before. But this was a declaration of war. I didn't bother calling. I wanted to see the look on her face when she explained this nonsense to me. By the time I reached the community center, an unnecessarily lavish building that I definitely hadn't paid for, Karen was already there, seated behind a massive oak desk, typing away on a tablet like she had something important to do. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, her pastel cardigan neatly pressed, her pearl necklace sitting just right. She looked up as I stepped inside, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Christopher," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "What a surprise." I pulled the letter from my pocket and placed it on her desk. "Care to explain this?" Karen picked it up with exaggerated slowness, as if she hadn't personally signed it, and skimmed through the contents. Then she folded her hands neatly, giving me a look that screamed condescension. "Oh, this is just standard procedure," she said with a practiced sigh. "HOA fees are non-negotiable, you know." I kept my voice steady. "I never signed up for your HOA." Karen let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "When you purchased your home, you entered into a binding agreement with the association. It's all in the fine print." I stared at her. "That's a lie. I read every word of my contract. There was no mandatory HOA clause." Her smile faltered for half a second before she covered it with another well-rehearsed expression of pity. "Well, perhaps you should have done more research." She slid the letter back toward me, her manicured nails tapping against the paper. "The bottom line is simple. Pay your fees, or your property will be foreclosed. The board has already approved the proceedings." There it was. The threat. I clenched my jaw, my mind already racing through the implications. This wasn't about money. I could wipe this fee out in a second if I wanted to. This was about control, about power, about Karen trying to prove that she ran this neighborhood. She had done this before. I could see it in the way she sat back, waiting for me to react like everyone else had. Anger, panic, bargaining. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, I let out a slow breath and straightened my posture. "I see." Karen's smile widened, mistaking my calm for surrender. "I knew you'd come around. Now I can have the paperwork ready for payment." I turned on my heel and walked out without another word. She thought this was over. She thought I would panic, scramble to write a check, and fall in line like every other homeowner she had bullied into submission. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I didn't make my fortune by backing down. I made it by outplaying people who thought they had the upper hand. Karen just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she could take my home. By the time I was done, I'd take everything from her. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. Instead, I did what I'd done 1,000 times before in boardrooms and negotiation tables. I smiled. I nodded. I let Karen think she'd won. Her smug expression told me everything I needed to know. She thought I was just another resident too afraid to fight back. Another victim who would grumble, pay up, and accept that the HOA controlled every inch of their life. What she didn't know? I'd spent my entire career dealing with people like her. Abusers of power, self-important gatekeepers, and greedy little tyrants who thought they were untouchable. I walked out of that community center with the letter still in my hand, my expression unreadable. But in my mind, the game had already begun. The first step was information. I spent the next few days quietly pulling at threads, watching as Karen's perfect little kingdom started to unravel. I started with the HOA's financial records. It wasn't hard. Most people didn't know where to look. But I did. I traced public filings, old budgets, and audit reports. What I found was a disaster. The HOA wasn't just mismanaged. It was drowning. Huge debts, unpaid maintenance fees, funds that had disappeared into vague expense reports. And at the center of it all, Karen Whitmore. She'd been hiding the truth from the homeowners, covering up the financial black hole with constant new fines and fees. It wasn't about improving the neighborhood. It was about keeping the scam alive just long enough to bleed the residents dry. But that was just the beginning. A deeper dive into the bank transactions led me straight to Karen's personal accounts. HOA funds had been funneled, disguised as consulting fees, community expenses, and miscellaneous administrative costs. Except the money didn't go toward fixing sidewalks or maintaining the neighborhood. It went straight into Karen's pockets. Vacation payments, spa trips, luxury handbags, even a tuition deposit for her son's private school. And yet, she had the audacity to tell people they were behind on their dues. Disgusting. I could have confronted her right then and there, but no, that would have been too easy. Karen was the kind of person who didn't believe she could lose. The kind who would twist a story to make herself the victim. If I wanted to take her down, I needed more. So I got it. The HOA meetings were supposed to be private, but I had my ways. A well-placed recording device here, a discreet microphone there, and suddenly, I had everything. Every conversation, every secret plan, every whispered deal Karen thought would stay hidden behind closed doors. I heard her laughing with her inner circle about how easy it was to manipulate the neighborhood. I heard her propose a plan to forcibly take over homes, slapping owners with so many fines that they had no choice but to sell, straight to investors she had deals with. I heard her bragging about how no one would dare challenge her, because who would believe them over the president of the HOA? The arrogance, the greed, the sheer audacity. She thought she was untouchable. She had no idea that I was watching, listening, waiting for her to make the biggest mistake of her life. A month passed in silence. I didn't fight the foreclosure notice. I didn't respond to the letters, the threats, the so-called final warnings. Karen thought I had given up. She thought she had won. That was exactly what I wanted her to believe. Then she made her big move. The official announcement came in the form of a neatly typed flyer. Public auction. Property of Christopher Mercer, plastered all over the community center, mailed to every resident and posted online. Karen had even arranged a special exclusive bidding session for hand-picked investors. She was giddy with excitement, practically buzzing at the prospect of selling off my house to the highest bidder. She had no idea what was coming. Auction day arrived, and the event was a spectacle. The room was packed with real estate investors, eager vultures circling what they thought was easy prey. Karen had pulled out all the stops, champagne glasses, polished brochures showcasing the exclusive opportunity to own the finest home in the neighborhood. She stood at the front of the room, practically glowing. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "this is a rare chance to purchase a premier property in our esteemed community. Bidding will start at a generous discount to market value, $400,000. A murmur of interest spread through the crowd. The bidding began. $400,000. $420, $450. The price climbed steadily, just as Karen had planned. She grinned, basking in the success of what she thought was her final triumph over me. What she didn't realize? The highest bidder was me. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Through an anonymous LLC, one of the many I had set up over the years, I registered as a bidder, blending into the sea of investors. No one batted an eye. I was just another nameless entity looking for a good deal. Every time a bid went up, I matched it effortlessly, watching Karen's satisfaction grow as the price climbed. She had no clue she was celebrating my success. As the numbers pushed past $700,000, a few investors began dropping out. Karen, still oblivious, leaned over to one of her board members and whispered, "This is better than I expected. We'll have a new owner tonight." She was right about one thing. There would be a new owner, just not the one she was expecting. Silence fell as the auctioneer called out the current bid. $780,000. Going once, going twice. I raised my hand. $1.5 million. The entire room froze. Karen's face drained of color. Investors whispered among themselves, stunned by the absurdly high bid. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, are you confirming a bid of $1.5 million?" I smiled. "Yes." A long pause. No one dared to counter. Going once, going twice, sold. A round of polite applause rippled through the room as people turned to see who had just shattered the auction. I stepped forward, adjusting my cufflinks, and finally let Karen see my face. Her jaw dropped. "You," she sputtered, her carefully rehearsed poise unraveling in real time. "But you." I took my time, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Then I leaned in slightly and said, just loud enough for her to hear, "I'm not just keeping my house, Karen," I smirked. "I'm officially the largest property owner in this neighborhood." The look on her face, worth every single penny. Karen had no idea what she had started. Winning back my house wasn't enough, not after what she had tried to pull. Not after she had spent years bleeding this neighborhood dry, bullying people into compliance, and threatening anyone who dared question her authority. No, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about taking everything from her. And so, I did what I had done my entire career. I played the long game. It started small. A few properties here and there, ones that had been slapped with excessive fines, ones whose owners were desperate to sell just to get away from Karen's iron grip. Through my LLCs, I quietly scooped them up, cutting off one of the HOA's primary sources of revenue, late fees and forced buyouts. Then I moved bigger. I went after rental properties, homes where landlords had begrudgingly paid HOA dues just to avoid dealing with Karen's harassment. Once I owned them, I told the tenants they didn't have to pay the HOA a single cent. Word spread fast. For the first time in years, residents began to realize something crucial. Karen wasn't as powerful as she pretended to be. She wasn't some all-seeing ruler enforcing absolute law. She was just a bully who relied on fear. And now, that fear was gone. It didn't take long before people stopped paying their dues. At first, it was a handful of brave homeowners, ones who had been quietly waiting for someone to push back. Then, more followed. Karen tried to fight it. She sent out threatening letters, warning of increased penalties for non-payment. Nobody cared. She scheduled home inspections, hoping to scare residents into compliance. They laughed and shut their doors in her face. And then, in a final act of desperation, she called for an emergency HOA meeting, demanding that every resident attend so she could restore order. It was supposed to be a show of force. Instead, nobody showed up. I arrived at the community center right on time, stepping into what should have been a packed meeting room. Instead, it was completely empty. Well, almost. Karen stood at the front, gripping her sparkly pink gavel like it was the last thing holding her together. Her eyes darted toward the door when I walked in, her expression flashing from relief to pure hatred in an instant. She was alone. No board members. No loyal supporters. Just her. I strolled past the empty rows of chairs, taking my time, letting her stew in the silence. Then I walked straight up to the front table, pulled out her chair, and sat down. I leaned back, clasping my hands behind my head, and smirked. "Looks like you're not the queen around here anymore, huh?" Karen's lips parted like she wanted to respond, maybe with an excuse, maybe with a final, desperate threat, but no words came out. She had nothing left. She had dug her own grave, and now all she could do was stand there and watch as the empire she built crumbled before her eyes. Karen wasn't done. Even after losing control of the HOA, even after watching her power slip through her fingers, she refused to accept defeat. I expected it. People like Karen never knew when to quit. And sure enough, a week after her so-called emergency meeting flopped, a thick legal envelope landed in my mailbox. I opened it with a smirk, already knowing what was inside. Whitmore versus Mercer. Karen was suing me. Her official claim? that I had used illegal financial manipulation to destroy the HOA, that I had engaged in fraudulent business practices, unfair competition, and my personal favorite, intentional infliction of emotional distress. I nearly laughed out loud. She was desperate, and I was going to crush her. The lawsuit wasn't just about money, it was about image. Karen had spent years ruling over this neighborhood like a queen, and now that her kingdom had fallen, she needed the world to believe she had been wronged. So she ran to the press. One morning, I turned on the news, and there she was, sitting primly in front of a camera, dabbing fake tears from her eyes. "I gave my heart and soul to this community," she sniffled. "And then this corporate bully came in and took everything. He tricked people, stole homes, and destroyed the HOA that kept this neighborhood safe." She played the victim card beautifully for about 24 hours. Then I played mine. See, Karen had spent years lying about finances, lying about rules, lying to homeowners, investors, and even her own board members. And the one thing liars always forgot, there's always a paper trail. So while she was busy crying for the cameras, my lawyer was busy releasing every single piece of evidence we had collected, the financial records, the proof of her embezzling HOA funds into her personal account, the recordings, where she openly admitted to forcing people out of their homes for profit, the falsified documents, where she manipulated HOA books to cover up missing money. It took less than a day for the tide to turn. The same news stations that had painted her as a helpless woman under attack were now flashing headlines like, "OA president caught in corruption scandal," "New evidence links HOA leader to financial fraud," "Karen Whitmore facing criminal investigation." Suddenly, she wasn't the victim anymore. She was a fraudster, a liar, a criminal. Karen had spent years making everyone else afraid of her. Now, she was the one running scared. Karen had spent years making sure everyone in this neighborhood feared her. But when the FBI showed up at her doorstep, it was her turn to be afraid. The investigation moved fast. Once the financial records were out in the open, it didn't take long for federal authorities to take notice. HOA scams were nothing new, but Karen's operation, it was something else entirely. 10 years of corruption, hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen through fraudulent fees, bogus fines, and falsified maintenance costs. And the best part? She had been so confident in her own power that she never bothered covering her tracks. Bank transactions linking HOA funds directly to her personal accounts? Check. Emails detailing her plans to squeeze homeowners until they had no choice but to sell? Check. Records proving she funneled money to fake companies that just happened to be registered in her son's name? Checkmate. By the time the FBI had finished putting the pieces together, the case was airtight. Karen Whitmore wasn't just a bad HOA president. She was a fraudster on a federal scale. The moment it all came crashing down was almost poetic. Karen had scheduled another television interview, one final attempt to spin her version of events. To make herself the martyr, the poor woman who had been betrayed by an ungrateful community. She had even dressed the part. Soft pastel blazer, a single pearl necklace, her makeup just dramatic enough to look like she had been suffering. She never made it to the interview. Because as she stepped onto her front porch, microphone in hand, the FBI swarmed her house. Flashing lights, agents in suits, a warrant with her name on it. The cameras caught everything. Karen's shocked expression, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The way she tried to argue, then scream, then finally beg. None of it mattered. They cuffed her right there on her perfectly manicured lawn, right in front of the cameras, right in front of the entire neighborhood. The same people she had terrorized for years, they cheered. I didn't celebrate, not openly, anyway. While the neighborhood threw a party, while people gathered to drink, laugh, and revel in their newfound freedom, I stayed on my porch. I sipped my coffee, leaned back in my chair, and watched from afar, like an outsider, like someone who had simply played the game and won. Karen had spent years thinking she was untouchable. She had no idea she was just a pawn in someone else's game. The neighborhood changed after Karen was gone. With the HOA officially dissolved, the residents finally had control over their own homes. No more surprise fines, no more threats, no more rules dictating the height of their grass or the color of their mailboxes. For the first time in years, people could just live. Some small things changed overnight. Holiday decorations stayed up as long as people wanted. Kids played basketball in driveways without fear of violating community guidelines. The old lady on the corner? She planted bright red roses, knowing no one could tell her they were too vibrant. Bigger changes took time. Without the HOA collecting mandatory fees, residents had to figure out how to handle maintenance, community spaces, and security on their own. But something interesting happened. People actually worked together. Instead of wasting money on Karen's shady contracts, the neighborhood pooled resources and hired legitimate services. Instead of arbitrary fines, they voted on real issues that actually mattered. And you know what? The neighborhood didn't fall apart without the HOA. It thrived. Of course, it didn't take long before people started wondering about me. One afternoon, a small group of residents approached as I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee like I always did. One of them, an older man named Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat. "Chris, we've been talking, and, well, we just wanted to ask." I raised an eyebrow. "Ask what?" A younger woman, probably in her late 30s, hesitated before saying, "Who are you? Really?" I let the question hang in the air for a moment. They had theories, of course. Some whispered that I was an undercover investigator. Others thought I was some kind of billionaire playing a long con. A few even joked that I was in witness protection. The truth, it didn't matter. I smiled, took another sip of my coffee, and finally answered. "Just a quiet guy." I shrugged. Who hates HOAs? That was enough for them. They laughed, shook their heads, and walked away, satisfied. I watched them go, a small smirk tugging at my lips. They would never really know. And that was just how I liked it. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras flashing as Karen Whitmore stood before the judge, her once perfect composure now in ruins. Gone was the pristine pastel blazer, the pearl necklace, the smug confidence she had worn like armor for years. Now, she was just a convict in an orange jumpsuit, hands shackled in front of her, awaiting her sentence. The judge's voice was steady, unwavering. "Karen Whitmore, you have been found guilty of financial fraud, embezzlement, falsification of records, and abuse of power. For over a decade, you exploited the residents of this community for your own personal gain." Karen's lip curled, but she said nothing. The judge continued, "You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in federal prison." That's when she snapped. "This isn't fair!" she shrieked, twisting against the guards holding her in place. "I was cheated. I was the victim." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karen turned, her wild eyes scanning the faces of former neighbors, former allies, people who had once feared her, now watching her downfall with quiet satisfaction. Then her gaze locked onto me, her face twisted in shock, then realization. "You," she breathed, her voice hoarse. "Who are you?" I didn't answer right away. I stood slowly, adjusting my cufflinks, buttoning my vest, taking my time as the weight of the moment settled over her. Then I smiled. "Someone you should never mess with." Karen's mouth opened, maybe to scream, maybe to demand an answer. But the guards didn't wait. They dragged her away. Her reign was over, and I never looked back. The neighborhood was different now. Gone were the warning letters, the absurd fines, the endless lists of rules dictating how people could live in their own homes. For the first time in over a decade, people were free. Lawns grew exactly how homeowners wanted them, some neatly trimmed, others wild and full of color. Driveways were filled with cars, not because they were abandoned, but because people no longer feared a fine for having guests. Kids played outside without worrying about noise complaints. The air felt lighter, as if the entire community had exhaled at once. There was no more HOA, no more Karen, and no one missed either of them. Of course, whispers still lingered about me. Some people thought I was an ex-cop. Others assumed I was a lawyer, maybe even a government agent. The braver ones approached me with half smirks and careful words, testing the waters. "So, Chris, what exactly do you do?" I just shrug, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "I'm retired." They never pushed further, because deep down nobody really wanted to know. They had seen what happened to Karen. They had seen how someone who thought they were untouchable fell without ever realizing who pulled the strings, and so life moved on. The neighborhood entered a new era, one without fear, without control. And as for me, I just sat back, watched it all unfold, and enjoyed the peace I had created. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. I sat back in my garden, coffee in hand, watching the world go by. Kids rode their bikes down the street without a care. A couple walked their dog, chatting easily. The air was calm, peaceful. This was what the neighborhood should have been all along. I had no regrets. Just as I was about to take another sip of coffee, a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Hey, Chris," a man said, stepping closer. I recognized him, a new resident. He had moved in a few weeks ago, long after Karen had been dragged away in handcuffs. I gave him a nod. "Evening." He hesitated, then smirked. "People talk about you, you know." I chuckled. "Do they?" "Yeah." He crossed his arms. "Everyone says you're the reason this neighborhood turned around, that you handled things." I said nothing, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he asked, "So, what do you do exactly?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, staring off into the distance as if considering the question. Then, with a small smirk, I replied, "I just help greedy people learn how to manage their money in the most painful way." The man blinked, clearly unsure whether I was joking or not. I just took another sip of coffee. Some lessons had to be taught the hard way.